Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my must-have breakout running backs for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 5 running backs in specific. Now, what they all have in common is the fact that thus far in their careers, none of them have ranked as top 20 running backs in fantasy football in a half PPR scoring format. But what they all also have in common is that in 2022, they could all very easily achieve that. And in some circumstances, if everything drops correctly, some of these running backs could very easily get into the RB1 conversation. Now, before I begin talking about statistics and sharing my opinion regarding these 5 players, I of course want to thank you guys for your viewership, commenting down below, clicking the like button. For those of you who have not yet already and are trying to get daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, whether it is breakout players all summer, whether it's draft strategies, all these kind of things. My strength of schedule video tier lists are coming down the line. A lot of content this August going into, of course, September through January, daily fantasy rankings in order to help you win a championship. So be sure to subscribe if you have not yet already. I appreciate it. Now, also, I wanted to go ahead and remind you guys, if you have not yet already checked out Underdog Fantasy, you can do that today by using the link down in the description or using promo code Andrew. When you sign up via Underdog using that code, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, we've talked about it over the last couple of days in regards to ADPs, in terms of how you're drafting and getting the best overall experience via Underdog Fantasy, drafting their best ball tournaments, and of course, getting yourself more experience before your home leagues begin. You can draft via Best Ball Mania 3 or the potential other tournaments that are available, like the Puppy 3, which is one of my favorites. So go ahead and check that out today. Use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about these stud running backs, potential breakout players in 2022, beginning with the man behind me, Cam Akers of the Los Angeles Rams. Now, the reason why I wanted to begin with Cam Akers as our first breakout option of the 2022 season is because there's a lot of weariness regarding his potential going into 2022. The last time we saw this man, he of course wasn't putting up great performances in the NFL playoffs, but he was still getting a high volume of opportunity. Currently, via ADP on Underdog Fantasy, he's going in the 4th round. And like I've mentioned in the last couple days, many of you have heard, I am not too keen on drafting running backs in that range, but I can't ignore the fact that running backs like Cam Akers and the others that I will be talking about via this episode are getting extremely high potential opportunities and could end up being in that top 20 RB conversation. It could certainly help us win a fantasy football championship. So let's talk about Akers in regards to what he did his rookie season. Of course, he was drafted as a 2nd round selection in 2020, immediately jumped onto the scene and was in a bit of a rotation. In 2020 began with Malcolm Brown in the backfield, Darrell Henderson, who was drafted the year prior, and of course, Cam Akers, who eventually, early on in that season, had a rib injury, kind of slowed his potential growth in that season, but eventually, he had his breakout game. In 2020, Week 12 against the San Francisco 49ers, there was a singular drive. You may be wondering, Andrew, how do you know this? I was watching the game. Any Rams game that's on, my eyes are glued to it. But either way, there was a singular drive in which on 3 consecutive plays, Cam Akers consisted of 3 rushing attempts that led to 68 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. That's 12.8 fantasy points in 3 plays. And from then on out, Cam Akers was crowned the lead back of the Los Angeles Rams. From weeks 13 through the NFL playoffs, Cam Akers was averaging 23.83 touches per game, 15.72 fantasy points per game, all while just under playing 72% of the offensive snaps. So obviously, going into 2021, many of us had the hype surrounding the potential of Cam Akers. Of course, a couple years prior, we had seen this team, the Los Angeles Rams, help Todd Gurley become the #1 overall fantasy back in consecutive years in a half PPR scoring format. So we thought to ourselves, well, very easily, Cam Akers should be a 2nd round selection at very worst. Now, as we all know, unfortunately, Cam Akers in July of 2021 had a season-ending Achilles injury. Now, at the time, we all considered it to be a season-ending Achilles injury, but little do we all know Cam Akers would eventually return. But in his absence, there was a lot of production by the remaining running backs within the Rams offense, whether it was Darrell Henderson or Sony Michel, who was traded for because of the injury that was sustained by Cam Akers. So let's talk about some of the production that running backs had in 2021 for the Los Angeles Rams. In fact, Darrell Henderson, Sony Michel, the combination of running backs in this offense from weeks 1 through 18 averaged 16.74 fantasy points per game. So if you were to consolidate all the stats into a singular back, that's how much they would have been averaging on a weekly basis, which is pretty considerably high and potentially available for Cam Akers if everything pans out well in 2022. Though consolidating the total stats to a singular running back is fantastic, the real reality of this backfield was Darrell Henderson dominated between weeks 1 through 12, and then Sony Michel took over from weeks 13 through 18. To give you some specifics, from weeks 1 through 12, Darrell Henderson was averaging 14.35 fantasy points per game and was fantastic. Then all of a sudden, the Rams switched it up on him. He took the bench, and then here comes Sony Michel, who was averaging 90 rushing yards per game from weeks 13 through 18 and was averaging 13.93 fantasy points per game. So, on average, the lead back of this team last season was averaging about 14 fantasy points per game, while the second string guy would get a couple touches here and there. But overall, great production, especially in an offense that is giving their respective running backs over the last 2 seasons the 9th most rushing attempts with 753 and the 19th most RB opportunities in terms of a total of 900. Now, when we talk about the value of said opportunities, obviously Rams running backs have seen a significant dip in terms of total targets, but in terms of red zone rushing attempts, that number has stayed at a premium level. In fact, Darrell Henderson and Sony Michel both had themselves, a lot of work in the red zone, specifically inside the 5-yard line. The combined contributions of Michel and Henderson was 13 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line for 7 rushing touchdowns. If that exists for a singular running back, for example, Cam Akers in 2022, that's a lot of value to be had. In fact, Sony Michel last season, just in the red zone alone, had the 3rd most rushing attempts in the National Football League. A total of 45 attempts, all while Darrell Henderson consisted of 24 rushing attempts in the red zone. As an entire backfield, the Rams running backs totaled 72 red zone rushing attempts for 9 touchdowns. A lot of potential there going into the future, which excites me for what exactly we can see from Cam Akers in 2022. Now, the conversation needs to be brought up. Andrew, Cam Akers looked awful in the NFL playoffs. In those 4 weeks, he was terrible. I 100% understand, but you have to look at it from the perspective of a medical anomaly. We're talking about a guy who just 6 months prior had torn his Achilles, was expected to be out the entire year. I mean, when I've looked into the potential studies that doctors have done regarding Achilles injuries and the return rate from players, the stats shown that 72% of players who have torn their Achilles have come back and played in the National Football League. So that means that there's more than 25% of players who don't even come back from said injury. Yet, the average return time is about 330 days, which is a year. I mean, Cam Akers cut that in half and said, hey, you know what? I'm coming back. And not only that, I'm going to average a consistent amount of opportunity in the NFL playoffs, 19.3 and then 18.8 touches per game throughout that span of time, playing 57% of the offensive snaps. And yes, it didn't lead to much, but the fact that this team was so willing to give him said opportunities, despite he was so ineffective, leads me to believe that once he gets to a point where he's rehabbed even more this offseason, they're going to continue that level of trust in 2022 and give him this high volume of opportunity that a lot of running backs in the fantasy football landscape currently are not privy to. So let's talk about the potential of 2022 and what I expect to see from this offense specifically. Like I mentioned earlier, the biggest concern I have regarding Rams running backs has always been receiving yards since Todd Gurley has moved on from this team. Sean McVay has ditched the idea of targeting his said running backs, and it's been at a pretty extensive rate. In fact, from 2017 through 2018, in 2 seasons, Todd Gurley was targeted 201 total times. In the last 3 seasons combined, all running backs from the Rams have only totaled 208 targets. In fact, in the last 3 seasons alone, the Los Angeles Rams have targeted their running backs the 3rd fewest times in the National Football League, which obviously is a concern, especially when we're playing in a half or a full PPR scoring format. But yet it doesn't prevent Cam Akers from getting to that 18-plus touch region, which is extremely valuable in fantasy football. Now, the next thing that I wanted to mention is, of course, offensive line, because it always is important to the value of a running back. Andrew Whitworth, Hall of Fame, future Hall of Fame offensive tackle, will be retiring after that Super Bowl victory, but I still think they have a lot of talent. Of course, they still have Rob Havenstein, Brian Allen as their center, Joe Noteboom, who has played in place of Andrew Whitworth when he has gone down with injuries last season. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Joe Noteboom played in that Tampa Bay Buccaneers playoff game, obviously played well in the place of one, Hall of Famer, but nonetheless, this is a stable offensive line. They've drafted pieces over the last couple of years in order to kind of bolster it up, and they still, at very worst, have Cooper Kupp, who's the 9th best run blocking wide receiver. So they're going to have some help up front. Even if the offensive linemen are going to miss, Cooper Kupp's going to get the job done because not only is the Triple Crown winner, but he's one of the best run blocking threats in the league, which is just ridiculous to me. The last point. When defensive coordinators every week are going to have to sit down and make a game plan to stop the Los Angeles Rams, they're going to have to know Matthew Stafford, Allen Robinson, Cooper Kupp, the threat in which exists there every single play, Van Jefferson, maybe OBJ, but now the potential of Cam Akers being a huge threat in that offense and running the ball 15 plus times a game. I think as long as Cam Akers can get to a point where his full recovery has gotten to his former self, or at least a little bit lesser than his former 2020 self, we could see a lot of potential upside in 2022 from Cam Akers. And that is why I think, based on his current ADP of being drafted in the 4th round, this is a guy that has extreme upside and can very easily outproduce his given ADP. All right, let's move on to the next running back who is staying within the NFC West. We're talking about a San Francisco 49er running back by the name of Elijah Mitchell going into his 2nd year in the National Football League. Now, Elijah Mitchell is a very interesting story because the majority of the conversation that revolved around San Francisco running backs last offseason, if you guys remember, was which of the two are we drafting, Raheem Mostert or Trey Sermon, running back, 3rd round pick out of Ohio State. Well, regardless of which side you were on in that conversation, both sides were wrong. Raheem Mostert, first game, first quarter against the Detroit Lions in 2021, season-ending knee injury. And then, unbeknownst to all of us, Trey Sermon had somehow, someway, landed himself in the doghouse of Kyle Shanahan along with Brandon Ayuk, and those guys did not see any touches early in the season. In fact, as soon as Raheem Mostert went down, Elijah Mitchell came in and he took over this backfield and did it in incredible fashion. The amount of opportunities he was given in fantasy point production was at an elite level, which is why I'm mentioning him today. His current ADP on Underdog has him going, 65th overall? At the current value, I'm 100% willing to invest in Elijah Mitchell. Even though I do talk about taking early running backs, it is hard for me to ignore such an incredible talent. And let's talk about those stats. In 2021, he started 11 games during the regular season. In those 11 games, he averaged 14.14 fantasy points per game due to the 20.64 opportunities and 20.55 touches per game. Again, those are workhorse elite levels of opportunity that I love to see from any running back. Now, if in fact you were to have taken the 11 games that Elijah Mitchell had produced, and we had assumed that he had stayed healthy for the entire season and had him play 17 games with those averages, this man would have been 240 plus points at the running back position and been the number 5 overall running back in a half PPR in 2021. Yeah, those are crazy numbers, but the opportunity was there and the offensive effectiveness obviously there. Not to mention, this is one of the more talented young running backs. Let's go ahead and put him in comparison to other elite players. Last season, he was the number 4th ranked running back in yards per carry after contact with 3.7 yards. Again, some running backs last year couldn't even get 3.7 yards per carry, much less after contact. He was only behind Rashad Penny, Nick Chubb, and Jonathan Taylor in this category. And another category he had excelled in was he was the number 4 running back in rushing attempts of 10 or more yards with 29 of those potential rushes, only behind Taylor, Chubb, and Cook. Again, elite categories and amongst elite players, making me think, of course, Elijah Mitchell can be trusted going forward. Now, the constant question that I continue to hear this offseason is, what is this 49ers backfield going to consist of? Because there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and typically Kyle Shanahan has wanted to run a committee situation over the years. For example, when Raheem Mostert went down, Elijah Mitchell stepped up and, like we mentioned, was averaging 20 plus touches per game. When Mitchell went down and we had to see Trey Sermon step in, the guy was averaging 16 opportunities per game, 15.5 touches. Obviously had a little bit of a dip considering Trey Lance was the starting quarterback in that Arizona Cardinals game. Rushing quarterback, less rushing attempts for said running back. But that level of opportunity was still consistent when Mitchell and Sermon were both out. And Jeff Wilson Jr. was the starting running back last year when he averaged 18.25 touches per game. This offense wants to have a primary running back. They want to give a player 18 to 20 touches per week. And in my opinion, all signs are pointing to that direction. Though in the past we've seen consistent running back by committee situations from the San Francisco 49ers, it's often been due to the fact that we've seen consistent injuries out of this backfield. I mean, when we look at the lead running back from the San Francisco 49ers over the last 5 seasons, we've only had one of those running backs play a full healthy year. Nonetheless, it was Carlos Hyde in 2017. And guess what? He was the number 9 running back in that year. So if you can find the combination of health in this Kyle Shanahan offense, you're going to have an extremely productive running back. And hopefully that's going to be Elijah Mitchell this year. Now, I understand the conversation of, yes, there's Trey Sermon, Jeff Wilson Jr. They also re-signed JaMycal Hasty. They also drafted Tyrion Davis-Price this season in the 3rd round. There's a lot of cooks in this kitchen. And even Deebo Samuel last season from weeks 10 through 18 was a huge part of this offense, averaging 6.47 yards per carry, 53 attempts, 343 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns in 8 games. That's 76.3 fantasy points. Almost 10 points per week of Deebo's production was being siphoned off of the running back position. Now, I think Deebo Samuel, based on his contract and the incentives that are in that, he will be rushing the ball far less. JaMycal Hasty is a special teams player. Jeff Wilson Jr. is only when a player goes down, he steps up. So otherwise, it's Mitchell, Trey Sermon, who's still probably in the doghouse, and Tyrion Davis-Price, who at this current moment in time is taking, 3rd string attempts in training camp. But again, all signs are pointing towards Elijah Mitchell potentially having a great year. Now, when we talk about Kyle Shanahan's approach, every single year, it's the same thing. They want to run the ball heavily. Of course, since 2017, the San Francisco 49ers have given their respective running backs the 7th most rushing attempts, 1,868, and they've given their respective running backs the 12th most total opportunities, 2,306. Last season, as an offense as a whole, they had the 5th most rushing attempts with 499, had the 7th most team rushing yards with 2,166 yards, and the 5th most team rushing touchdowns with 22. Obviously, there's a lot of potential in this backfield, but another thing that makes me extremely excited is the addition of Anthony Lynn as the assistant head coach / running backs coach in 2022 for the San Francisco 49ers. If you guys remember, Anthony Lynn used to be the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers from 2017 through 2020. Throughout that time, the Los Angeles Chargers gave their respective running backs the 2nd most total opportunities and 10th most rushing attempts. You go back to 2021 with the Detroit Lions. Of course, he was the offensive coordinator running backs coach for them. Those running backs had the 5th most RB opportunities and the 10th most RB attempts. Typically, what we see when Anthony Lynn joins an offense and a coaching staff is that RB opportunities via targets skyrocket. Could very easily be a potential outcome to the addition of Anthony Lynn to this offense. You get Elijah Mitchell, Tyrion Davis-Price out into the flat for check down options. We could see ourselves in a fantastic position with getting even more upside because of that receiving threat that often 49ers running backs haven't had in years past. We move on to the final things that I wanted to mention regarding this offense. Obviously, Kyle Shanahan, the scheme that they run consists of a lot of zone, pulling lead options, whether it's a tackle, guard, tight end, fullback, a lot of power, counter, man schemes, outside zone, which, when you have the best left tackle in the National Football League, and Mike McGlinchey, who in 2020 was the 2nd best run blocking offensive tackle, obviously was injured in 2021. When you have 2 of the best run blocking offensive tackles in the league, outside zone is going to obviously be one of your biggest threats. The interior of their offensive line has been demolished in terms of depth. Obviously, they lost Lincoln Tomlinson. They lost their center this offseason in Alex Mack. So there is the potential that they may be a little bit weaker in the interior of their offensive line, but they're still going to have some guys that are going to compete. They drafted a couple guys in the NFL draft. They still have George Kittle, the 9th best run blocking tight end. Charlie Warner, who's the 3rd best run blocking tight end in the National Football League. Juwan Jennings, who's the 4th best run blocking wide receiver in the National Football League, all according to Pro Football Focus. Kyle Juszczyk, who is a threat. These are all things that are going to potentially help Elijah Mitchell accomplish that singular goal of not only being a top 20 running back in fantasy football, but maybe getting into the closer high-end RB2 range, which can help us win a fantasy football championship. Final thing I wanted to mention. For those of you who are worried about Trey Lance's potential upside of rushing, decreasing the opportunities of the respective running backs on this team, I don't fault you. Again, when I look at the 2 starts that Trey Lance had last season, he had 24 rushing attempts. In those given weeks, the running back position had seen a total of 6 less rushing attempts than on a normal per week average when Jimmy Garoppolo was a starting quarterback. And they also saw a dip in terms of total targets. When a rushing quarterback scrambles as much as Trey Lance is probably going to do this upcoming season and is going to have as many designed runs as he will most likely have, there may be a little bit of a dip in terms of total opportunity, but there's still a potential for an offense to have a 1,000-yard rusher and still have a top 12 running back. Let's go back to 2019 Baltimore Ravens. Lamar Jackson, an insane year with 1,200 rushing yards, yet Mark Ingram was still able to become a top 12 running back in that given season with the production level that he had. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that Elijah Mitchell could accomplish the same. Let's move on to our next running back. Currently, out of all the running backs that I'm mentioning today, in terms of breakout candidates, he is being drafted the highest on Underdog Fantasy, currently at an ADP of 35.2, meaning he is coming off at the end of the third round. Kind of at that point where if in fact you wanted to still start 2 running backs in your first 3 rounds, start, wide receiver, second round RB, Travis Etienne in the third, there's a pretty good chance for you at the back end of the first round to grab Travis Etienne and find a lot of potential success in 2022. And the reason why I say this is because he is a first round running back, a former first round selection in 2021, obviously had that Liz Frank midfoot injury last year during the second game of the NFL preseason, which forced him to miss the entire season. Now, before I talk about the potential of Travis Etienne in 2022, I want to set a foundation as to what this Jacksonville Jaguars backfield has been in years past. Obviously, you go back to 2019, Leonard Fournette was an RB1 in terms of rankings and a half PPR. 2020, James Robinson was an RB1. Both of those guys had handled 80+% of their backfield's overall touches and obviously produced very well despite the Jacksonville Jaguars offense being in rough situations, but mainly because of game scripts, often got a lot of targets. When we look at what James Robinson did in 2020, 16.14 fantasy points per game is no joke. He was the number 7 running back in that year. Not only that, this last season, even with Urban Meyer as the head coach, James Robinson was still a great running back prior to his week 6 injury against the Seattle Seahawks. Again, throughout weeks 1 through 6, he averaged 16 plus fantasy points and was the number 7 overall running back throughout that time. So we've seen a consistent level of production from running backs in this offense over the last couple years. Now, obviously, James Robinson did in fact tear his Achilles against the New York Jets. It was a grade 3 tear, pretty brutal. Like we talked about a little bit earlier in regards to Cam Akers, the typical kind of turnaround for a running back is about 330 days, practically a year. It looks like to us that James Robinson is at training camp. He was not put on the physically unable to perform list. He is getting himself ramped up for the season. But which James Robinson are we getting? Are we getting the 16-point monster, or are we going to get the one that looked like Cam Akers in the NFL playoffs? My opinion is that we're going to get the Cam Akers in the NFL playoffs because oftentimes the burst that running backs need to make those quick cuts has vanished once that Achilles injury has taken place. And when they come back that first year from return, often you don't see much production. So if we get a season in which James Robinson is rendered ineffective, then of course Travis Etienne has a lot of opportunity for success in this respective offense. Now let's talk about a couple of the changes in this overall organization. Urban Meyer's gone. They brought in former Eagles head coach Doug Peterson, a guy that has formerly won a Super Bowl. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Doug Peterson used to be the play caller for those Eagles teams once Frank Wright left and went to the Indianapolis Colts. So we've seen a lot of Doug Peterson's approach back in the days with the Philadelphia Eagles, and he should be able to bring that to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Of course, from 2017 through 2020, the Philadelphia Eagles gave their respective running backs the 16th most rushing attempts and the 17th most total opportunities. Those aren't the greatest numbers, but middle of the pack will get it done in comparison to what Jacksonville Jaguars running backs have had to deal with in the last 2 seasons comparatively. Now, there's always been a narrative that surrounded Doug Peterson as to whether or not he can commit to a singular RB1. That narrative is relatively untrue. A lot of the times that he has had to spread opportunities amongst multiple players in a backfield with Philadelphia often had to do with injuries. Jordan Howard going down with one, then Miles Sanders comes in. So when we go back to 2019 and 2020, the last 2 seasons of Doug Peterson's reign with the Philadelphia Eagles, of course, in 2019, in 16 games, Miles Sanders had a total of 242 opportunities, 229 touches, pretty decent number. And in 2020, with only 12 games played out of Miles Sanders, 216 opportunities, 192 touches. Again, relatively high numbers, so I'm not too worried about the narrative that regards Doug Peterson splitting carries amongst backfields. Now, if in fact the narrative said he never gives a running back 300 plus touches, I'd say yes, that is true. And we're not going to see that out of a guy like Travis Etienne. But we will see Travis Etienne split this backfield relatively with James Robinson until James Robinson has proven himself ineffective, and then it'll all begin to funnel in the direction of Travis Etienne. I mean, I expect Travis Etienne to be the primary receiving back of this offense, and of course have a lot of production on the ground, because that is what he has shown in his career at Clemson. Now again, let's not forget, this is a former first-round running back. There weren't that many first-round running backs over the last decade of the National Football League. In fact, since 2012, the last 10 years, there have only been 15 running backs selected in the first round. Now, of those 15, if you don't count Travis Etienne, because of course he didn't play a single game in his rookie year, we have 14 running backs. Of those 14 running backs, 12 of them had 220 plus touches in their rookie year. Of those 12 running backs that had 220 plus touches, 8 of them were RB1s in their rookie seasons. There has been a lot of high upside production from first-round running backs over the past decade of the National Football League. But when we isolate those 12 running backs that have all seen 220 plus attempts in their rookie years, we were seeing incredible numbers, averaging over 1,000 total yards, averaging 9 touchdowns, 200 plus fantasy points, all of those lining up. So perhaps Travis Etienne may join these other first-round running backs and continue that trend in 2022. Now let's talk about Travis Etienne. Now that we've kind of covered everything that this offense has to offer, let's see what he personally, as a talent, can provide for us in fantasy football. Obviously, Travis Etienne already has the rapport with his former quarterback in college, Trevor Lawrence. They were both first-round picks in 2021, and they will continue to find that success here in 2022. From 2017 through 2020 in college, Travis Etienne accounted for 4,952 rushing yards and 70 rushing touchdowns. I mean, just insane numbers. On top of it, in the last 2 seasons of his college career, he accounted for 85 receptions, 1,020 total receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. If you already have a rapport with your quarterback and you're going to be the check down stud in a team where you probably aren't going to be winning many games, those game scripts are going to be against you. We've heard all offseason that DeAndre Swift this year is what Austin Eckler was last year. Well, with that math, I could very easily say that maybe Travis Etienne is this year what DeAndre Swift was last year. A guy that is being drafted, in that 3rd, 4th round range that has the immediate upside of being a top 12 running back. Now, not only was he given rushing attempts and receiving threat in college, he also had the most red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line in the NCAA between years 2018 through 2020. So despite his stature, yes, he is going to be a goal line back. I can assure you that. I think there's a lot of potential for him in this offense. Obviously, last year, Trevor Lawrence only targeted his respective running backs 15.61% of the time. That was a total of 94 targets. Hey, if we can get 94 targets and 85 of them are going towards Travis Etienne, he's going to catch maybe 65 of those opportunities. We have high levels of production there because the rushing attempts will certainly be there. The rushing touchdowns will eventually accommodate themselves with his overall production. But if you can for sure get those receptions, my goodness, his entire fantasy outlook changes. Now, obviously, a lot of the help that he's going to get besides Trevor Lawrence is going to have to come from that offensive line. They did sign Brandon Sheriff, former Washington Commander, a guy that was a first-team All-Pro in 2020, a 5-time Pro Bowler, an All-Pro guard. I mean, again, one of the better offensive linemen. They went ahead and they got rid of 2 of their worst offensive linemen, AJ Cannon and Andrew Norwell. They are gone. And though the rest of this team in terms of run blocking is average, we've still seen a lot of production from lower end teams behind average offensive lines find a lot of production. Cough, cough, Najee Harris, Saquon Barkley in seasons past. So as we approach 2022, if we see James Robinson be the Cam Akers of the NFL playoffs and be relatively ineffective, and the volume of receptions continues to rise for Travis Etienne, I think we have ourselves a huge breakout stud in 2022. Moving on. Let's talk about another running back that is going into their first year. Breece Hall, running back of the New York Jets. A former Iowa State running back selected in the 2nd round of the 2022 NFL Draft. Obviously, coming out of college. This is one of the more athletic and accomplished running backs in this respective draft class, as he had 3,000 rushing yards, 46 touchdowns, and 59 receptions in his last 2 seasons at Iowa State. A lot of productivity. In fact, was the number 7 running back in the NCAA last season with missed tackles forced with 72, and had the 7th most carries of 15 plus yards last season. I mean, when you're talking about a running back that has 4.39 40-yard dash speed, of course, he is an elite athlete, and he'll be able to demonstrate that in the NFL because it's not going to be too fast for him. So let's talk about what a second-round running back could potentially produce in 2022. Again, when I looked at the success rates of second-round running backs over the course of the last 5 years in the National Football League. Since 2017, there have been 17 running backs that have been picked within the first 50 selections of their respective NFL drafts. Okay, 17 players. 14 of them were active in their given year. Obviously, Travis Etienne, Ronald Jones, and Dalvin Cook all missed time due to injuries their rookie years. So of the remaining 14 running backs, we had a distribution of 5 of those players being RB1s, 5 of those players being RB2s in their given rookie year, and 3 of them being RB3s. So 13 of those 14 total running backs were top 36 players. So from my perspective here, I'm thinking to myself, from the history of running backs, there is a very strong case for a running back like Breece Hall, who the Jets thought so much and so highly of. They were going to trade a pick away to go up 2 spots in order to ensure that they got their workhorse running back of the future. We may in fact have another one of these workhorse running backs that could end up being in that top 15 conversation, like we have seen many other running backs get into. I mean, we look at Javonte Williams last year. Despite the fact that he was splitting touches last year, still finished with like the number 17 overall running back. There is a lot of potential for a player like Breece Hall, who, like I mentioned, not only got it done on the ground, but had a lot of potential in the receiving game. And quite frankly, will be behind a fantastic bruiser offensive line in a scheme that should help him. We'll certainly talk about that in more detail, but I also want to address the conversation regarding Michael Carter. Michael Carter last year was a 4th-round pick out of North Carolina. In the games that he started and played fully without leaving with an early injury, he averaged 9.74 fantasy points per game. That's 14 games last season, playing 50.45% of the offensive snaps. So even in his rookie year, Michael Carter wasn't even the workhorse back. He couldn't maintain the job without having Tevin Coleman, completely washed, and Ty Johnson, who primarily is only a receiving back in the National Football League, come in and take away total touches and opportunities from him. I mean, this isn't a surprise. Michael Carter in his college career split touches and snaps with Javonte Williams. Neither of them was able to maintain a lead back threat, and it seems like Michael Carter still not going to be able to do so in 2022 with the apparent arrival of Breece Hall as the workhorse in this offense. Now, I also wanted to maintain and jot down a note regarding Zach Wilson. He should be the starting quarterback of this offense. Of course, he was the number 2 overall pick of 2021. I went ahead and figured out last season how many times per game he targeted respective running backs in those games that he was healthy. 12.5 of those games he was in, good to go, and how often they ran the ball when he was in the game. Again, if you're going to get 19.3 running back rushing attempts per game and about 5.6 targets per game, despite these extremely negative overall game scripts from the New York Jets, seems like there's a lot of workhorse opportunity to me for Breece Hall. The final couple things I wanted to mention regarding Breece Hall revolves purely around the offensive line and the offensive play calling. Of course, the offensive line, in my opinion, should be one of the best across the National Football League in terms of run blocking. When you have George Fant and Mekhi Becton as your offensive tackles, you have Vera Tucker, who was recently drafted, Connor McGovern, Lincoln Tomlinson that they got from the San Francisco 49ers. They have one of the most consistent run blocking offensive lines in terms of overall grades, according to Pro Football Focus last year. Again, Mekhi Becton in 2020, when he was healthy, he was the 22nd best run blocking offensive tackle last year. Vera Tucker was the 19th best guard. Connor McGovern was the 8th best center. Lincoln Tomlinson was the 16th best guard. There's a lot of production here. We have Corey Davis, formerly of the Tennessee Titans, who obviously had to learn how to run block for the Titans. He's the 6th best run blocking wide receiver in the National Football League. You bring in CJ Uzomah. You bring in Tyler Conklin, who can continue to be lead blocking threats. Of course, a former offensive coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers. And I understand the overall opportunities via rushing attempts, targets weren't great for running backs last season for the New York Jets. But with this scheme in place, with the offensive line in place, and now your workhorse running back of the future, these outside zone, power, counter schemes are going to find a lot of success. Now you bring in tight ends that are going to be lead blockers for this offense. So if that's not enough to convince you as to how much this team is probably going to lean towards running the ball in 2022, let's not forget Kyle Shanahan, the 49ers over the last 5 seasons, they've been in the top 7 in terms of running back rushing attempts. Matt LaFleur, who is the brother of Mike LaFleur, the current head coach of the Green Bay Packers, they're always in the top 10 of that category, whether it's rushing attempts or opportunities for their respective running backs. I think there's a lot of potential for success. I'm not expecting Najee Harris level of opportunity, but I'm expecting a lot of production out of one Breece Hall. Let's move on to our final running back, and maybe one that I'm most excited about, which is A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. We've talked about A.J. Dillon in regards to Aaron Jones. He was one of my top 12 running backs ranked going into the 2022 season in a half PPR scoring format, but that doesn't scare me for the potential in which A.J. Dillon has in 2022. Just a brief history. Again, this is a guy that was a second-round selection out of Boston College, 6 feet tall, 250-pound bruising back. In his rookie year, obviously this backfield was impacted by the fact that Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams were both active pieces. Jamal Williams, in those years with the Green Bay Packers, was averaging about 150 opportunities a year. At most was getting 150 touches. Now, Jamal Williams in 2021 went to the Lions, and A.J. Dillon has an opportunity to step up. And not only did he step up, but he took over in this backfield at times. I mean, he not only had 224 total opportunities and 221 total touches, but he was able to get himself to a point where he finished as the number 23 overall ranked running back in fantasy football. He wasn't a top 20 guy, but I think he can certainly get into that conversation with the opportunities that will be presented to him in 2022. Now, a lot of people will look at A.J. Dillon and think, well, he's a bigger running back. He's probably going to just get a bunch of touches and he'll be fine. And to be honest, in his career, he has been fine with just touches alone. Again, whenever he is seen in his career 2020 through 2021, 10 or more rushing attempts in a game, he's averaged 14.09 fantasy points per game. He's had 10 contests in which he's been given said opportunity, but he's also been an incredible receiving threat. I know a lot of people look at Aaron Jones and think, well, he's going to get himself 10 targets a game due to the absence of Devontae Adams. And we'll talk about that in the future, but I really do think that A.J. Dillon is just as capable in the receiving game. Last season, 37 targets led to 34 receptions, 313 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. He had the 30th most receptions amongst all running backs last year, and really didn't have that much opportunity. If we get into a situation in 2022 due to the absences of other threats in this offense where A.J. Dillon is playing more than 45% of the snaps, that as you can see on screen, when he does, in the 7 games that he has played more than 45% of his offensive snaps, he's averaging 16.71 fantasy points per game, and we can get him 10 plus touches per game on the ground, the sky's the limit, and the potential continues to rise for this young man. So let's talk about this backfield. Obviously, we've mentioned it in regards to Aaron Jones, but for those of you who didn't hear that conversation, the Green Bay Packers from 2017 through 2018, prior to the arrival of Matt LaFleur, was a team that was amongst the bottom of the league in terms of total RB opportunities and rushing attempts. In fact, they were 32nd in attempts from 2017 through 2018 and 30th in opportunities. League worst. You get Matt LaFleur into this offense, he brings over that Tennessee Titans running scheme, and bada boom, this is a team that in both categories, attempts and opportunities over the last 3 seasons, is in the top 10. That's fantastic. We'll continue to see this offense develop. Now, though these statistics are extremely important, the primary reason I wanted to bring it up is because I did a little bit of research in regards to 2 running backs on a singular team being both top 24 producers. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, we have seen 9 teams have 2 top 24 running backs in a given year. Of those 9 teams, in 8 of those circumstances, those respective teams were top 10 in terms of total running back opportunity in that given year. For example, last season, the Denver Broncos had Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon, both top 24 backs. In terms of total RB opportunity, they ranked 9th in the National Football League. Last year as well, the Green Bay Packers had 2 running backs ranked within the top 24. Aaron Jones at 12 and A.J. Dillon at 23. They were ranked 10th in total RB opportunity last season. Seasons prior, of course, we've seen Cleveland, Indianapolis, Washington, the Los Angeles Chargers all accomplish this and all be within the top 10 of RB opportunity in that given year. So considering we have seen a history of success from this backfield, we can guarantee that A.J. Dillon is going to be in that conversation of being a top 24 back, but just how high is he going to elevate his game in 2022? Well, that's mainly going to have to do with how much he relatively plays. Again, the reason why he was given such a boost of opportunity late in 2021 was because of the injury that Aaron Jones sustained against the Seattle Seahawks. From weeks 12 through 17, Aaron Jones still played, but he was limited based on his offensive snap count and opportunities. Those all dipped, yet Aaron Jones throughout that time was still putting up 12 fantasy points per week, while A.J. Dillon stepped up and filled in the rest, and throughout that time, from weeks 12 through 17, was averaging 12.6 fantasy points per game. Throughout that 5-game span, A.J. Dillon was the number 17 overall running back in fantasy football, and Aaron Jones was the number 20. So we've seen both these running backs coexist at the exact same time. Even with Aaron Jones quite limited, we've still seen them coexist and find success. And not only that, while they've coexisted in this offense in respective games, we have seen A.J. Dillon score all of his touchdowns in games in which Aaron Jones was active. In fact, last season, A.J. Dillon had more red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line than Aaron Jones. That even led to more touchdowns. Again, A.J. Dillon, as you can see represented by A.D. on screen, 10 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line for 6 rushing touchdowns, while Aaron Jones had 4 rushing attempts inside the 5 for 4 rushing touchdowns. So again, we're getting to a point where A.J. Dillon is no longer a handcuff. Certainly, he is going to be the handcuff of this offense because I expect him to be the 1B option. I see it in my head as a 1A, 1B instead of a for sure RB1, for sure RB2 of this given team. And though he may be considered a handcuff, if anything's to ever happen to Aaron Jones, we immediately launch A.J. Dillon into the top 10 conversation, maybe even as a top 6 running back based on the amount of opportunities his backfield has been given and his ability to receive the ball out of the backfield and find a lot of success in doing so. So not only is he a flex player this year who can sit in your flex option, currently going around an ADP of the 5th/6th round, I think, 66th overall, according to Underdog Fantasy. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for this man to even go further beyond what he accomplished last year. Now, of course, the conversation needs to be brought up. What exactly will this offense look like without Davante Adams and Marquez Valdes-Scantling? Of course, you lose 2 of their primary wide receivers, and we still don't know if Robert Tonyan's going to immediately be back because of his ACL injury. But over the course of the last 3 seasons, in the 8 games that Davante Adams has either not played entirely or left early due to injury, the running back position for the Green Bay Packers has found extreme amounts of success. They've averaged 38.33 fantasy points per game in those 8 contests, and running backs throughout those times were averaging 24.63 attempts per game and a total of 11 dedicated targets. And over the course of the last 3 years, because A.J. Dillon hasn't always been with this offense, Aaron Jones has primarily, taken the fantasy value that has been presented to him because of the absence of a Davante Adams. But I think the absence of Davante Adams not only will give Aaron Jones opportunities, but will only elevate the opportunities of A.J. Dillon because he is an extremely talented back. And if you're going to give him even more work on the ground and through the air, again, a breakout season can very easily be upon us. Now, the final thing I wanted to mention, Packers offensive line in 2022. What could we anticipate to see from these respective players? Well, there's been a lot of talent lost from this offensive line. They are not re-signing a lot of these players. This offseason, they lost Dennis Kelly, Lucas Patrick, Billy Turner. The season prior, they lost their center, Corey Linsley, which is, in my opinion, one of the best in the National Football League. David Bakhtiari, still recovering from that ACL injury. Outside of Elgin Jenkins, there really isn't a good offensive lineman left in this entire group. I mean, if Bakhtiari comes back and is close to what he was, then you have 2 good offensive tackles. But the interior of this offensive line has been demolished via free agency in the last couple years. That is a little bit worrisome. But when we're talking about the Green Bay Packers offense and the threat of Aaron Rodgers and defenses not being able to stack the box and the threat of A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones getting a lot of receptions out of this backfield, there's a lot of potential for success in 2022. That just about does it. That covers our 5 must-have breakout running backs for the 2022 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Let me know down in the comment section if you agree with any of my takes today, if you think there's another running back that should be a part of this list, and perhaps there are even deeper sleepers, maybe a Ramondre Stevenson, someone of that category that is in a run-first offense that could end up taking over and becoming a huge breakout in 2022? Let me know down in the comment section. Be sure to like, subscribe if you have not yet already. And if you haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, be sure to do so using promo code Andrew. There's a link down in the description. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.